DArthur. We need to begin with a brief history of early English. And to talk about that, we want to talk about the tribes that came over and settled in England. The Celts were the first known tribe that we're going to focus on. They crossed the English Channel and they invaded Britain in the 700s BC. The Gaels were the earliest wave of the Celts to come. They settled in the northern and western part of England. What followed were the Britons. That was the second wave, and they settled in England and in Wales. They traded in France and with Celtic tribes that were in Ireland. The Romans ruled Britain for about 400 years. In 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius defeated those Celts, and then the Roman troops left in the early 400s to defend Italy and the neighboring territory from barbarian invasions. So about 400 years, the Romans ruled and then left. In the early 400s, when those Roman regions left, England was invaded then because there was no one to defend it. Germanic tribes came in. They were from Denmark and from Germany, and they drove these Celts and the Romanized Britons into remote areas of Wales and Cornwall. Those are areas that are, here's Wales right here, so into these areas. The Angles and the Saxons were the most powerful of these tribes. The Angles then settled in northern and central part of England, while the Saxons settled in the southern part of England. The other tribe we don't know much about were the Jutes. They settled in southwest England, in Kent, and at the Isle of Wight. But the Angles and the Saxons were the most powerful, and that's why the language is now known as Anglo-Saxon. Wales, Cornwall, and the Highlands of Scotland were held by the remaining Britons, the Celts that were left over from the earlier rules. In the 6th century, these invaders were almost overcome by this shadowy figure. That means we don't know a whole lot about him. We just know a few details. He was a general, and he is later developed by legend into what we know as King Arthur. Some say that he was a general named Arturius. We'll get to him a little bit later. Eventually, the Celtic people then withdrew into the mountains of Wales and Scotland, or across the sea to Ireland and to Brittany. Brittany is France. The Anglo-Saxons ruled until the mid-800s, when the Danish invaders came in and they attacked England. All of the Anglo-Saxon territory except Wessex, which is down in the southern part, all of that area except Wessex was conquered. Alfred the Great became the king of Wessex, and he forced the Danes to withdraw to the eastern part of England, to the what they renamed as the Danelaw. So you can see they pushed them out this way. And then in 1016, Canute, who was a Dane, he defeated the king of Wessex, and he became ruler of England. After Alfred's death, the Danes gradually expanded their territory. So now we need to talk about the Norman conquest and why that was important. Well, Edward the Confessor was the last Saxon king. He died in 1066, and he had no direct heir, no children to be able to take the throne. The English nobles chose Harold, who was the Earl of Wessex at the time. They chose them to be their king. They liked Harold. He was a good ruler, and that's who they wanted. But a French nobleman, whose name was William of Normandy, he claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. William, thinking it was rightfully his because he said Edward promised it to him, he invaded England and conquered England in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. So he became king of all England. Here's Normandy, here's England, here's Hastings right here. So you see that it was very small way to cross the English Channel to come over, and at the Battle of Hastings, that's where this decisive battle occurred. Well, the result was that England was now conquered land once more. The Normans divided up the land, and the Anglo-Saxons became serfs. So let's talk a little bit now about the story of DArthur. Arthur was based on a 6th century British cavalry general, not a king, whose name was Arturius. He won 10, and some historians say 12 battles against the Saxons, and took possession of London. In the decisive battle in that possession was at Mount Badon in 517. We think that he was probably a Celt originally from Wales, and we know that he died in the Battle of Camlan in 538 near Glastonbury. We'll see that Camlan is a place that many of the Arthurian legends surround. In the Middle Ages, he was the object of deep and sincere reverence and belief. People in the Middle Ages actually believed that it was the king, that he was going to unite all of England. Camelot was where Arthur lived with his Queen Guinevere and the Knights of the Round Table. It's probably where Cadbury Castle now stands, and that's near Glastonbury in southwest England. It's reportedly where Joseph of Arimathea built the first Christian church in England. If we pause here for a moment, Joseph of Arimathea was supposedly the man who provided Jesus Christ with the tomb that his body was laid in after Jesus was crucified. Joseph then was said to have possibly been the person who collected the Holy Grail, pieces of the cross, actually knew what happened. And so when Joseph of Arimathea came over to England, he built the first Christian church. There's the connection between why we think that the Holy Grail would have been in England. So some details of the story. The story lacks realistic detail. All we know about Arthur from the book is that he has gray eyes. We don't have any other attributes. Lancelot and Tristram, who are the two best knights of all we know about them is they're big men. All the ladies are described as being fair. So there's not a lot of realistic detail to the stories. Yet these characters are very real people. The stories that they go through, the connections that the reader makes them very real people. We know that there's no real depth of Christian belief. That's because we have Christian details, but we also have magic and enchantment right along with it. We know that extramarital affairs are very common. When we read through the Merlin chapter, we will see several extramarital affairs. And we see Tristram and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, Arthur and Margaux. We know that it would dishonor a knight to repudiate this. It would dishonor a knight to go against these things. The offspring of these affairs were accepted unless incest was involved. And we'll find out that the result of the relationship between Arthur and Margaux was Modred, Arthur's son. And we see that Modred becomes the top villain in the story at the end. The knights do not forgive their enemies. Vengeance is very common, so that goes directly against the Christian belief, even though they are searching for the Holy Grail. The philosophy throughout this book is really one of doom. We have forces that will both build and destroy kingdoms. We have paradox. These are events that support and undermine the kingdom at the same time. A relationship with one king may prove beneficial at one point in the story and turn around years later and be extremely detrimental to that kingdom. So Malory's stories are full of battle and jealousy, sexual lust, sudden rage, frustrated idealism, and the waste of human potential. They're not happy stories. Here's a tapestry that has Arthur, and this is Lancelot here, and this is Guinevere. Malory's sources were several Norman French romances, and an English alliterative epic that was called Morte, Arthur, which means the death of Arthur. After the Norman conquest, the Britons in William's army combined their own traditions of Arthur with those that were in Wales. So the French tales used Arthurian legend to show chivalry and courtly love. The British tales made Arthur into a national hero. This was the man that was going to come back and was going to unite England and save England and make sure that England was restored to its position as the best ever. Malory combined all of these sources, the French sources, the English sources, and he combined them and tried to write something like a coherent story, a history of Arthur from his birth to his death. Those are the sections that we'll actually read. But in between, we'll see there are a series of stories. And so the book is still rather episodic instead of united in plot. Every once in a while, there'll be a story about Lancelot, some random story about him, a random story about Gawain and other of the knights. So the publication of this book itself, so why are we reading this? Well, we need to speak about Sir Thomas Malory. He lived from about 1400 to 1471, and he was a respectable citizen for most of his life. He was knighted in 1442, and then in 1450, we know that he suddenly became an outlaw. We have this through records. He was charged with robbery, cattle raids, extortion, rape, and attempted murder. So something happened in his life that he went from being a knight to being one of the most hunted criminals there was. We know he escaped from jail and then spent the rest of his life in and out of prison. Le Morte Arthur was finished while he was in prison around 1469 or 1470. And then Malory died in 1471, shortly after finishing this work. If you know what this is, we will question you later about that. It was the book itself was printed by Caxton in abridged form in 1485, and it was the first major work of prose fiction in the English language. We've read the Canterbury Tales, which you know are poetry because we talked about the rhyme of each one of those. You've read through those, but this book was the first printed work of prose fiction in the English language. And that's the end of our lecture about King Arthur.